Hello, class, and welcome back for Chapter 2. So, this is an introduction to culture. What can you learn about culture from a Happy Meal? Um, and typically, if we were in class, I would have brought a couple of different versions of Coca-Cola so that you could blindly test the difference between American and at least Mexican Coca-Cola to see the difference in the way that they taste, how they're bottled, how they're manufactured. So, what culture is behind it? Culture is made up of shared meaning, belief systems, and knowledge. It includes shared ways of seeing and understanding the world. Look at culture like an anthropologist helps us see the hidden complexity in things that seem normal or obvious. For instance, we may consider eating a simple biological need. The kinds of food we buy and when we eat and who we eat with vary across cultures. More broadly, we can think about who grows our food, who harvests it, where, and by whom it is processed to be shipped somewhere but we can buy it. Culture underlies all these processes, and we'll see how over this course, over the course of this chapter and lecture, how that is done and what role culture plays. So, these are our big questions. Ethnocentrism. Very important to understand what ethnocentrism is. The difference in human society today represent adaptations to different environments as well as different histories. Knowing that is very important. Thinking one's way of doing things is better than another culture's way of doing things is ethnocentrism. So, or in other words, one's own ways are superior or the only way of doing things, and they're not willing to see another's culture as valid. Cultural relativism. All beliefs, customs, and ethics are relative to one's own social context. Right and wrong are culturally specific. No one has the right to judge another culture's customs. So, what exactly is culture? The term culture has many meanings. In popular usage, it is often equated to the distinctive traditions of different ethnical groups. An example of this would be Mexican Macarena music, Chinese food, or British theater. These are certainly representatives of culture, but they are only the tip of the iceberg. Culture is also popularly used to notate so-called refined sensibilities. That is to say that one could be cultured for enjoying classical music and the theater, in contrast to popular music and Hollywood blockbusters. Anthropologists use the term in a different manner. For anthropologists, culture is a very broad concept. Specifically, it does not involve value judgments or someone being more cultured or less cultured. So, culture was first defined by anthropologist Sir E.B. Taylor in 1871. That complex whole, which includes knowledge, belief, art, morals, law, customs, and any other capacities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. As you can see, the definition is very broad. Since Taylor's day, literally hundreds of definitions of culture have been forwarded. Let's see what your book's definition is. Culture is a system of knowledge, beliefs, patterns of behavior, artifacts, institutions that are created, learned, and shared by a group of people. this definition is still rather broad. So let's kind of narrow down this idea a little more. Culture is learned and taught. Culture, to the modern anthropological view of culture, is that it is learned. A person must be enculturated. That is, you must learn the culture you live in. This is contrary to the old notion, often racially motivated notion, that one is born into culture. If a culture is learned, then it must be taught. This is done in many ways, but often a child's first teacher are his or her parents. We raise our children to emulate what we think is normal. We teach them how to talk to adults and how to interact with their peers. There are many other cultural teachers in society. Simply taking a part in social activities with other people is perhaps the most basic form of cultural education. Children quickly learn what is and is not acceptable in a group interaction. Stealing toys, for example, quickly results in group sanctions or other kids not wanting to play with them. Ah, what's going on? Okay. Hopefully this didn't mess up too much. Um, Schools often form a core function of cultural education. Not only do students learn math, history, and science, but they also learn about birthday parties, national holidays, and traditional forms of celebration. As culture continues to change, cultural learning and teaching becomes a lifelong activity. So, culture is shared yet contested. Culture is inherently a group concept. It is a shared experience that derives from the living members of a group, although there may be smaller subcultures within the large culture. For example, the culture of your college classroom is embedded within the larger American culture. At the same time, you know that nothing in the culture is permanent. For example, American culture has recently debated the topic of same-sex marriage. While this is a substantial legal discussion, there's a cultural question. And say, is same-sex marriage okay, regardless of specific legal standings? In recent years, public opinion and legal opinion have made substantial movements toward a collective concept that same-sex marriage is permissible. This is not even remotely this was not even remotely true 20 or even 10 years ago. The central idea here is that culture is contested. We have a shared culture that we learn from our fellow group members. Once learned, culture is not static. When there are parts of it that people do not like, those parts can be changed. The act of changing culture, however, is very difficult and can usually only be seen over a long period of time. Culture is both symbolic and material. Culture is structured or created through various processes. There are four main concepts that can illuminate this process. The four main concepts illustrate the symbolic and material aspects of culture. They are norms, values, symbols, and mental maps. Even within a culture, not everyone shares equally in the institutions about these ideas, but each of the elements powerfully frames what people can say, do, and sometimes even think. We will take a look at each of these symbolic and material aspects of culture in more depth. So, norms. Norms refer to the ideas or rules about how people should behave in a particular situation or towards certain other people. These are ideas or rules about how people should behave, um, such as eating and when you can eat. Norms are constructed through regular practices. That is to say, they are created by the most common actions of people within a group. Marriage norms are a good example. In some cultures, marriage within the group, endogamy, is common. Others may marry outside of the group. Exogamy is instead the norm. So let's go ahead and go to values. Values, cultural values are a fundamental belief that what is important, what makes a good life, what is true, right, and beautiful. Cultural values develop out of shared history and background. The United States is heavily influenced by the Puritan colonists that helped found many of the continent's early settlements. Thus, values such as hard work and denial of pleasure, general abstinence, are often seen as worthy values. Even to this day, many companies value workers who do not use their vacation days, but instead work straight through the year. In other culture, vacation is valued. It is thought that workers, if take a break, come back stronger and better able to do their jobs. Values have a way of changing over time. In the end, not all values are shared values. Like cultural norms, there are some values that are common but not universal to a culture. Symbols. Cultural norms and values are often expressed through symbols, particularly when we consider that even language is a symbol. Simply put, a symbol is anything that represents something else. Language is a common human tool for symbolic abstraction. However, language is an abstraction where sounds stand in place for concepts or an idea. For example, consider the word tree. If tree were a fixed symbol rather than an abstract, everyone around the world would use the same word. Instead, there are an infinite variety of words that also signify tree. Language is the ultimate tool for symbolic communication of cultural norms and values. In fact, how can I even talk to you about cultural norms of value? Language. However, it's just the tip of the iceberg for cultural use of symbols. And there are many ways. So, mental maps of reality. The human ability to use symbols ties directly into our use of mental maps. Mental maps of reality are cultural classifications of what kind of people and things exist and the assignment of meaning to those classifications. Mental maps represent people's attempts to distill the complex world around them into the understandable categories. The world around us is incredibly complex. You can't look at every blade of grass, every cloud, even at every person who walks by. Our brains are hardwired towards classification. We lump things into categories, thus making it easier to navigate the world. Our own personal mental maps are heavily influenced by cultural contrasts, norms and values, and what we think is important. And symbols suggest how we encode that information. So, how has the culture concept developed in anthropology? So now we're going to look at how it was developed. The cultural concept is an essential part of anthropology. Ever since Sir E.B. Tylor offered a definition of culture in 1871, which we saw a few slides ago, culture has been the primary focus of study for all anthropologists. However, culture is a broad concept that has given rise to many debates within anthropology. There are debates regarding how it should be defined, how it should be understood and studied, and how we should describe it. So, to better understand the culture concept, we are going to take a step back and look at some of these debates. Early evolutionary framework. The earliest anthropologists, such as E.B. Tylor and his colleague James Frazer and Lewis Henry Morgan, primarily described to the evolutionary model of culture. Working in the late 1800s, these scholars were heavily influenced by Charles Darwin and his new book on the origins of a species. Evolutionary theory was very popular and very widely adopted in a variety of different disciplines. Early European anthropologists noted that many cultures that had encountered around the world were less technologically and socially complex in comparison to European culture. As a result, they began to argue for the evolutionary sequence in culture. They saw less complex cultures as less evolved. Lewis Henry Morgan developed an evolutionary typology. He classified cultures belonging to one of the three different stages of evolution: savagery, barbarism, and civilization. This theory, that all cultures naturally evolve through the same sequence of stages from simple to complex, was referred to as unilateral cultural evolution. Setting aside the judgment-based problems of referring to other cultures as savages, anthropologists began to argue that data simply did not fit this simple evolutionary concept. As anthropologists studied more and more cultures around the world, new ideas began to form about culture. American historical particularism. In the United States, the reaction against evolutionary frameworks was led by anthropologist Franz Boas. During his career, Boas worked with both Native American cultures and immigrant European cultures. Outside of the annals of anthropology, Boas is best remembered for his work fighting against racial stereotypes that Eastern European immigrants faced in the United States. Boas argued that evolutionary framework for culture were narrow and restrictive, thus not capturing the true picture of how culture developed. In his response, he found a school of historical particularism. Boas argued that in order to understand a culture, you needed to learn about its particular, i.e., unique history. This idea, historical particularism, argues that cultures develop in specific ways because of their unique histories. This argument helped to explain the difference between many Native American cultures. It also helped to achieve a measure of equality for European immigrants. As a professor of anthropology at Columbia University, Boas helped to train the subsequent generation of anthropologists, thus influenced the extent far down the line. Perhaps the most famous of Boas' students is Margaret Mead. Mead carried out on the torch of historical particularism in her study of coming of age in Samoa. In her trip to study the culture of Samoa, Mead noticed the startling difference. In the United States, female adolescence was widely considered a difficult and challenging time in a young woman's life due to the biological changes in a woman's body, but Americans explain the difference as a biological reality. But Mead noticed that in Samoa, adolescent girls did not experience the same period of disruption. She began to realize that the emotions and difficulties surrounding female adolescence in the United States, while perhaps biological at base, were deeply cultural. In short, there are particular patterns to culture of Samoa and the culture of the United States. As a result of her study, Mead has a strong impact on the burgeoning women's rights movement in the United States. Next, we have British structural functionalism. British anthropology took a different tact than their American counterparts. In response to the evolutionary school of thought, British anthropologists developed the beginning to known as structural functionalism. The general approach of this school of thought was to examine how different structures within a culture functioned to keep the system as a whole in equilibrium. Structural functionalists took a scientific approach to the study of culture. As much as possible, they looked at the control of the field studies to examine particular structure. As a result, many studies were done on kinship structure, political structure, religious structures, and so on. The idea was that if we could isolate these structures or these systems, we could understand them better. Looking at a smaller picture, there is less detail to overwhelm you. On the smaller systems, we are well understood. They can be pieced back together to understand the culture at large. E. Evans Pritchard's ethnography, The Norm, in 1940, is a classic example of this school of thought. Evans Pritchard went to great lengths to study and describe separate structures of the Nora culture. He included their political, economic, and kinship structures. While different from American response, which emphasizes a culture's unique history, British structural functionalism was highly influential. This helps us move to a better understanding of cultures around the world. Cultures and meaning. Our final step in developing a modern understanding of cultures can be seen as a reaction against the American and British schools. While British school of structural functionalism carries a certain logic, it is easy to argue that culture is more than the sum of its parts. Simply understood, a kinship system and a political system does not mean you understand the nuances of norms, values, and symbols found within a culture. Likewise, American historic particularism school can perhaps explain the influences of development of the culture, but not necessarily why it developed the way it did. After all, different people in different cultures react in diverse ways to similar events. Clifford Geertz led the charge in the 1960s for a new um, interpretive approach. A conceptual approach sees culture as a symbolic system of deep meanings with many layers. To understand the kiss in Western culture, you must understand many layers of meaning. In order to achieve such an understanding of another culture, it was argued that the detailed descriptions and careful observations were in order. So, understanding requires a simple description of what an anthropologist might think is important. There should be descriptions of all the details of the event. This way, the more subtle symbols can gradually be observed and understood. So, out of this approach came Geertz's study of the Balinese cockfight, showing how even the smallest moment can offer insight into a culture. Okay, so are culture and power related? Hopefully, by the end of this class, you will know the answer to that. So, power and culture institutions. Most recent scholarship on culture has argued that power is a crucial component to understanding how cultures work. Power is often described as the ability of potential to bring about change through the action and influence, either one's own or a group's institution. While we often think of power as seated in an individual, your boss, your parents, the president, power is often controlled by cultural institutions. Religious institutions are perhaps the most obvious example. For example, the Catholic Pope often comes out and dictates morals, norms, and values for its adherents. On a smaller scale, local churches, synagogues, mosques, temples, and so on have great influence over their communities. Other institutions, such as schools and legal systems, highlight differences in power. Power is embedded in many kinds of social relations, and the power in a culture reflects stratification or the uneven distribution of resources and privileges among participants in a group or culture. By examining the way access to these resources is organized, we can begin to use culture as a conceptual guide to hegemony. Gramaski. When discussing culture and power, it is useful to make the distinction between material power and hegemony. Material power refers to the more traditional signs of power, political, economic, or material, such as it exert through the coherence or brute force. Hegemony refers to the power to create, contest, and agreement within a population without using use of threat or power of force. Most notably in America, European military power sought to control the Americas. Many missionaries sought to convert the Native Americans. The result of these conversion efforts created the state that we see today. There are many Native groups that have been disenfranchised from economic and political power. They have also inherited a mixture of indigenous and Christian religious beliefs. Such religious synchronism is found throughout much of the Americas. Human agency. Hegemony and cultural institutions can be extremely influential sources of cultural power, yet we cannot overlook human agency. Agency is an academic term that is similar to the concept of free will. Your textbook defines it as the potential power individuals and groups have to contest cultural norms, values, mental maps of reality, symbols, institutions, structures of power. Humans are deeply influenced by their culture and its institutions of power, but that does not mean they cannot step outside of it, critique it, or shape. How much of who you are is determined by biology and how much is cultural? Anthropologists generally hold that the majority, if not all, of the variations come from cultural differences. Many people over the years have argued that biological differences between people also affect behavior. Nature versus nurture. Human beings across the globe have nearly identical genetic codes. Every person on this planet has a genetic code that is 99.99% identical to everyone else. This is remarkably similar in genetic necessities that have same biological needs. All humans must eat, excrete, and protect be protected from the environment. And yet, even within those basic needs, we see tremendous variations. Food and dietary patterns vary across the globe. Often, food is not a simple matter of taste or style. Rather, there are major distinctions in what people eat. Many cultures around the world hold certain insects as delicacies. Many Chinese people dislike cheese in all forms. Others consider fish eggs or caviar as delicious. Even patterns of excretion vary. Public toilets in China are often made up of simple hole in the ground over which a person squats. In India, the water is used in place of the Western preferred toilet paper. So, in spite of similarities, we tackle all these problems quite differently. The degree to which nature or biology versus nurture, our culture, and the way we were raised affects our capacity has been a long-standing debate. So, from being human to becoming human becoming's a biocultural process. So, this isn't to say that our environment has no influence on our gene. In fact, an emerging field of study called epigenetics is beginning to examine the way in which the environment one is born can directly affect the expression of genes during one's lifetime. These markers may change in response to the process that anthropologists frequently study: nutrition, stress, disease, social inequality, migration, and more. Epigenetic markers can be inherited across generations, facilitating integration transmission of environmental information that may shape the direction of evolutionary change within the species. So, there's direct links between specific genes and specific behaviors have proven very difficult to identify, but the field of study we've just discussed shows that culture does have the power to shape the biological factors that define us, despite the popular ideas that nature has driven our development as humans. We cannot discount the influence of culture on our evolutionary history as a species. The development we go through in our own lifetime as individuals. Indeed, over time, some culture adaptations, fire, language, contraceptives, have replaced the genetic adaptations as a primary way that humans adapt to their environment. So, how is culture created? Culture is something that is created by the members of a group. While each new member undergoes enculturation, pressures from cultural institution, human agents, and other historical forces bring change. Cultures react to the change en masse, creating new forms of the original culture. Typically, the process of cultural change is long and difficult to observe. Um, Manufacturing the desire to consume. In order for a consumer culture to thrive, meaning a culture where buying and selling items is highly valued, there must be a desire to consume. This is known as consumer demand. As consumer culture has grown in strength in the United States, there has been an ever increasing need to create consumer demand. The fact that our culture has embraced this consumer trend can be seen by the way in which consumerism prevails throughout our lives. We cannot skip giving gifts on Valentine's Day or Mother's Day without risking social sanctions, despite the subjective nature of these holidays. Advertising. The practice of advertising has long been seen as a key component of manufacturing the desire in consuming. In fact, the modern Western world, advertising agents have become extraordinarily influential cultural institutions. All seek to enculturate us to their systems of value. The influence of advertising is perhaps most notable to the extent which we allow it to prevail in our lives. Everything from our clothing to our electronics is branded. We become a walking advertisement for the products that we purchase. More traditional advertisements are found at every turn, from magazines, newspapers, billboards, TV, radio commercial, and virtually every website on the internet. So, financial services and credit cards, with the creation of the desire to consume, we have we have one more necessity for consumer culture, the ability to consume. While credit cards are found throughout our lives today, they actually only began to grow in popularity about 40 years ago. It was only after the denigration of banks in the 1970s that the development for this technology became necessary. Now credit cards are foisted onto college students that promise the ability to consume and delay the cost, thus creating a cycle starting consumer demand that then requires one to work for the already received goods. All of these forces, consumer demand and credit, have come together to permanently change our own culture. As we have seen, globalization allows for people of the world to be even closer in even closer contact. This contact and communication has a tremendous effect on culture worldwide. To anthropologists, one of the most startling effects is the degree of cultural homogenization that has begun. This is to say that cultures are adapting values, norms, and symbols from one another in such a way that many cultures are becoming more like one another. A simple example of this phenomenon can be found in a children's backpacks around the world. In virtually any country around the world, you can find children wearing Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman backpacks. The American film industry has exported its blockbusters worldwide, and as a result, it's created a shared culture of fantasy. So, migration and the flow of culture. Not all globalization entails the loss of cultural diversity. Increasing levels of migration with the improved transportation technologies have led to the shared differences of cultural traditions. When migrants move to a new place, they bring their cultural values and norms with them. The values and norms often change to a certain extent to accommodate their new environment, but they can also influence their new environment with their old culture. Many neighborhoods in the United States benefit from this diversity, interacting cultural traditions. With every improving communication technology, migrants can often remain in contact with their home cultures, thereby strengthening their cultural retention. This back and forth process of cultural sharing and influence is what we call a global flow of culture. So, increasing cosmopolitanism. Finally, increasing globalization has led to the increase in cosmopolitanism. That is to say, there's an increased awareness of belonging to a global community. Even the most remote corners of the globe today house people who are aware of global issues. Radio, television, and internet broadcasts allow one to learn of global developments from virtually anywhere. While some people choose to engage more or less with their surrounding world, the option is now there. Increased cosmopolitanism has led to a broader global outlook. As anthropologists, we look to find if we find this hopeful. A chance for increased understanding and tolerance between cultures is always an encouraging thought. So, habitus. We have orthodoxy, heterodoxy, and it is Bourdieu. So, habitus is the internalization of cultural roles. Norms created through cultural practices, cultural capital, social status systems related to habitat are related to habitus. So these are the frameworks for understanding and how we embody our culture and history and normativity. So we have habitus are our norms, kind of the circle. Orthodoxy, that is the attempt to keep everything within the habitus, and the norms the same. The heterodoxy would be the pull away from that normativity. Okay, so I want you all to kind of look at a Happy Meal and how it is very cultural. So, how is food tied into culture? How is food and power related? How are biological and cultural influences shaping your experience with food? How is your food culturally created? How is your food experience being transformed by globalization? Think about that for a little bit. Okay, concept check. Human culture is E, A, and D, taught through formal instruction as well as learned informally. The framework that anthropologists use to challenge ethnocentrism is C, cultural relativism. An early evolutionary framework of cultural variation, anthropologists tend to describe Western culture as decivilized. The study of epigenetics tells us even our genes can be affected by the environment. A. So, kind of just look at this discussion question slide for a few minutes, pause, whatever, um, and think about it. Let these kind of guide how your discussion questions will go. So, keep